My name is Yeonji Kim, and I am Communications Officer at the IEU, and I have the privilege of moderating today's event. Our side event today is titled, How does the IEU DataLab enable and support evaluations? The example of the SIDS evaluation. Before we start, just a little bit of housekeeping for an optimal Zoom experience. So when you are not speaking, please kindly mute your mics. If you haven't done so, I kindly ask that you do it now. And throughout the event, you're welcome to post your questions in the chat box. And when we do an open Q&A towards the end of the program, we will try to answer as many questions as possible. And during and after this event, you are welcome to share your thoughts about the event on social media using the handle @GCF_eval. All right, let me briefly talk about the focus of today's side event. As you know, the IEU recently completed its independent evaluation of the relevance and effectiveness of the GCF's investments in small island developing states that we call SIDS in time for B27, and the evaluation report was submitted for board circulation. This report will be made available online at a later date on the IEU's micro website. And in this event, the IEU's DataLab will present how they enabled and supported the various data needs for this specific evaluation. So briefly, here is today's program. It's a quite simple program. After my intro, we hope to show you our 2-minute DataLab video. I think that that's an excellent way to introduce to you our DataLab colleagues and the team and the types of tasks that they do on a regular day-to-day basis. And we will hear from our DataLab colleagues. They will do a quick presentation on how they supported the data needs of the SIDS evaluation. And then this will be followed by a 30-minute Q&A at the end. So introducing today's presenters, Mr. David Huang, Ms. Lauren Toktoha, and Mr. Peter Mwandri, all from the IEU's DataLab. So we look forward to hearing from them on their experience in supporting the SIDS evaluation. So, as I announced before, we will show you our new DataLab video.
The DataLab is essential,
objective,
impactful,
fun, collaboration,
innovative,
creative,
precise, hardworking,
high-quality analysis,
GIS,
credible evidence.
my dream come true. No other evaluation office has it.
All right, we hope you enjoyed that sweet 2-minute video. A shout out to IEU's communications workstream who produced this video. So many thanks to Eben, the videographer of our workstream as well. So We will now begin the presentation by our Data Lab colleagues. Let me hand over the mic to the first speaker, Mr. Peter Mondry. Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Yonji. Hello, everyone. My name is Peter Mondry, an evaluation researcher at Independent Evaluation Unit. I will start this presentation by introducing the IEU DataLab. The IEU DataLab consists of multidisciplinary team with various backgrounds, including economics, machine learning, GIS, behavioral science, statistics, and others. The objective of the Data Lab is to lead all related data work for IEU evaluations. For the past 2 years, the Data Lab have supported on delivering more than 6 evaluations, including performance review of the GCF, country ownership assessment, ESS, and others. In the next slide, I will take you through the standard role of the Data Lab to a typical IEU evaluation. Data Lab start to provide support to evaluation team from the very early stage of designing and developing the evaluation matrix. Upon the understanding the evaluation questions, the Data Lab move on in developing and preparing the extraction tools for data collection from various sources. And this depends on the evaluation needs. We can identify which section of funding proposals or reports or which policy we should consider to look at. And mostly at the IEU Data Lab, we extract data from funding proposal, then systematically record those information into machine readable format for easy analysis and visualizations. But before incorporating any analysis into evaluation report, the Data Lab runs validation and triangulation process to ensure all data included are accurate and consistent. And this leads to high quality evaluations and also produce other IEU products like working paper, which supports the IEU in pushing the boundaries of evaluation and remain at the frontier in developing state-of-art theories and methodologies in the field of climate change. Going forward, to ensure the reliability and validity of the evaluation recommendation, it's very important to ensure the credibility of the data sources. Depends on the evaluation questions, the data sources can either be within GCF internal document and IT system or external to the GCF. When thinking of the external sources, we use trusted public available data, example and gain, which provide information about country vulnerability and risks, and also UN agencies and other climate funds. We use internal GCF sources when answering the evaluation question related to efficiency of the GCF processes and operations. For instance, how long it takes from the funding proposal submission to when it was approved by the board. Correspondingly, we conducted the financial analysis looking at how much of the GCF finance reached to developing countries. You can further learn more in the coming Show Me the Money working paper produced by the Data Lab. With that, I will hand over to my colleague, David Huang.
Thank you, Peter. So in my role as an IEU evaluation researcher, I heavily supported the FIDS evaluation. The FIDS evaluation was one of the 4 evaluations undertaken by the IEU in 2020. However, due to its timing, it suffered the disadvantage of being the first mover of IEU evaluations in responding to the emerging challenges faced by COVID-19 as it broke at the beginning of 2020. The FIDS evaluation was forced to quickly adapt to the compounding effects of this unforeseen event. This impeded the usual methods and workflow of a typical IEU evaluation. For example, the lack of travel meant that all of our country missions had to be conducted virtually, while the closure of GCF offices in February meant remote working and collaboration as staff members dispersed all over the world. Finally, the cancellation of physical events meant that we had a lack of in-person engagement with our stakeholders. So we missed out on a lot of the values added from the chance encounters and the opportunistic conversations that might arise from events such as the physical workshop or a board meeting or a seminar of some sort. So despite all this, the FIDS team had to adapt without compromising the integrity and quality of the evaluation. So the next slide will show how the DataLab helped the FIDS evaluation team to address the challenges faced by COVID. First of all, we will be looking at virtual interviews. Key informant interviews have always formed an integral part of IEU evaluations. However, in previous evaluations, virtual interviews were quite rarely conducted as evaluation teams would go on week-long country missions to directly interview the stakeholders. Similarly, internal interviews with GCF would also be usually conducted in person. Due to the restrictions from COVID-19, the majority of the interviews undertaken for the FIDS evaluation were conducted virtually. While there were many difficulties associated with this approach, the FIDS team were able to adapt accordingly and ensure that a wide range of evaluation stakeholders were interviewed and a lot of important qualitative evidence was collected. Conducting surveys was another evaluation method that was adversely affected by COVID-19. The FIDS evaluation had to rely exclusively on online surveys as the lack of physical engagements and meetings meant paper-based surveys was not feasible. The online surveys was especially helpful in helping to validate the findings from virtual interviews for a better triangulation of qualitative information. Aside from these qualitative methods of evaluation, we also provided support to the FIDS evaluation through geospatial and quantitative analysis. The use of geospatial data analysis was especially vital in the absence of country missions, as it helped the FIDS team understand the geophysical aspects and characteristics of both projects and countries. So despite not actually visiting the countries, the use of geospatial analysis allowed the FIDS team to get a sense of the remoteness of the islands in the Marshall Islands and a sense of the vastness of the ocean space in the Seychelles. Ending on that point, my colleague Laureen will take everyone through some specific examples of how geospatial data analysis was applied for the FIDS evaluation.
Thank you. So I'm Lorraine. I'm a data lab and GIS intern at the IEU. I would like to introduce a couple of maps that the IEU DataLab have produced for the SIDS evaluation. The maps are co-created by the GIS teams within the IEU DataLab, consisting of Galina, Nayong, and I. The first map is a map of the SIDS and its travel time to the most accessible urban center, which is used as a proxy for measuring SIDS comparative transaction cost. Transaction cost is defined as an amount paid in order to buy or sell something in addition to the price of the thing itself. There are also factors such as population size to comprehensively measure transaction cost. However, in our evaluation, we have limited the analysis to only look at travel time to the most accessible urban center as a main proxy. One of the key questions during interview was transaction cost, as many SIDS are physically constrained, for instance, remoteness-wise. This was assessed by using geospatial analysis with data on travel time to the most accessible urban center in each of the 14 GCF eligible SIDS. So the implication here would be the longer it takes for an individual to go to the nearest urban center, the more costly it would be for the individual to acquire goods needed from the urban center. The map in front of you shows the median travel time to the urban center in the 14 GCF eligible SIDS, with a proportion circle which vary according to the travel time to urban center. The longer the travel time to urban center is, the larger the circle is. We can see from the map that countries in the Pacific region have overall longer travel time to the respective most accessible urban center, with a median at 41 hours. In contrast, other countries, such as the ACE or Caribbean region, the median travel time to urban city is less than 3 hours. In the case of Marshall Island, it's one of the countries with the longest median travel time to the most accessible urban center. What does this duration imply? As in the case of Marshall Island, if GCS were to fund a project in the country, there will be implications to the transportation cost, especially if the project were to focus on the remote island away from the capital or an urban center. In a project, especially with infrastructural components where materials have to be transported to the respective implementation site, with long travel time to reach the remote island, the project costs would increase significantly. Thus, such factor could be an important aspect of designing a project or determinant to accredit an entity when bringing forth a project to the GCF. To highlight one of the main recommendations from the SEEDS evaluation, as transaction costs due to factors such as remoteness as demonstrated in this map could pose a potential barrier for SEEDS in receiving funding from the GCF. Thus, the SEEDS evaluation recommends that to decrease the potential burden of transaction costs, GCF needs to finalize its policy on programmatic approach and ease potential bottleneck for SEEDS. Now I'm going to present you another example of geospatial analysis. So this other example of geospatial analysis done by the IEU DataLab is part of the country case study. Belize is one of the 6 countries the SEEDS team select as country case study. In normal circumstances, SEEDS team would have gone to country mission to physically visit project site and surrounding environment. However, due to COVID-19, as explained before, no country mission could have been conducted. To overcome this barrier, the SEEDS team and the GIS team within the data lab rely on geospatial analysis to better understand and bolster findings from the virtual interview. So let's jump on our next map before you on the type of land use in Belize. For Belize, the project used for the geospatial analysis is FP101. The title of the project is Resilient Rural Belize, by Resilient. It's a project with a value of $20 million with $8 million financed by GCF. From the funding proposal, we learned that the project will increase resilience of smallholder farmers in Belize to climate change impacts that have negative consequences on agricultural yield of important commodity for the country. And the project will initially work in 23 communities in 5 of the 6 districts. With this understanding, geospatial analysis was done to assess the type of land use on intervention site, in addition to examine whether the intervention sites are mostly made up of rural land use while considering the sectoral focus of the project. You can see from the map on your left the proportion of land use for agricultural and urban area in the different districts of Belize, with agricultural land in yellow and urban area in blue. The bar chart on the top right is matching color scheme of yellow and blue, summarizing the amount of agricultural and urban area for each of the districts in Belize. As shown in the bar chart, Corozal, a district excluded from FP101, as one of the least amount of agricultural land in Belize. On the right map, the intervention site of the project is colored in green. The pie chart on the bottom right gives you the type of land use in percentage for the intervention site. We can see that more than half of the intervention site are forest covered. As expected, the results show that the intervention site of FP101 consists mostly of forest, vegetation, and agricultural land. In addition to reliance on the land use data, we also add the layer of national province capital in Belize to the map. So, what this layer helps us to confirm is whether the intervention sites are nearby or within the national provincial capital. As one expects, national and provincial capital are areas with concentrated industrial activity. Thus, one can also see through this map, in fact, the intervention sites are not nearby industrial activity surrounding the national and provincial capital. So now I will pass the floor to my colleague, David.
Thank you very much, Lorraine, for giving us some great examples of how geospatial analysis supported the SIDS evaluation. Now we will look at a case study in which each of the 4 previously mentioned evaluation methods of virtual interviews, online surveys, geospatial data analysis, and quantitative data analysis were all utilized together in helping the FIDS team generate a credible policy finding. So this case study is based on work the FIDS evaluation team conducted in looking at whether the process of GCF accreditation is responsive to the needs of the FIDS. So given that the relevance of the GCF accreditation model in the FIDS was an important evaluation question, we felt this was a very significant question to answer. Now we can begin by looking at a piece of analysis which visualizes the proportion of national entities across the 5 different stages of the accreditation process. The GCF accreditation process is a linear one. These stages progress from left to right in order of progress towards finally become GCF board accredited. So you can see here, for example, that there are 61 national entities who are currently applying for GCF accreditation. So, and 8% of these belong to FIDS. As the FIDS proportion is colored in maroon, whereas the non-FIDS proportion of national entities is colored in green. So given that FIDS actually make up 26% of all GCF eligible countries, we can see through the proportions that they are clearly underrepresented in each stage of the accreditation pipeline. So this piece of quantitative analysis was important as it supported the evaluation team's initial theories that national entities in the FIDS were struggling to move through the GCF accreditation process due to the fact it was too technically complex and too time consuming. And a lot of these entities did not have the staff resources to successfully progress through the accreditation process. Now, the next slide is another data visualization. It is the box plot. So here we're looking at the days spent between non-FIDS national entities and FIDS national entities who have submitted an accreditation application. So the days spent is how much time they spent preparing for this submission of application. There's one line intersecting each of the box plots. This denotes the median time in days for these 2 groups of entities. And you can see that FIDS national entities spent 379 days preparing for application submission, whereas non-FIDS spent 126 days. This is a huge difference, clearly 3 times the amount of time was forced by the FIDS were forced to spend on median 3 times as much time as non-FIDS. So this gave further credence to our initial theories that the FIDS nationals were struggling in the accreditation process, possibly from a lack of capacity and staff resources. So in the next slide, we can see how qualitative evidence from virtual interviews and online surveys was able to further validate some of our emerging findings from the quantitative analysis. So here we have a quote from one of our virtual missions that essentially conveyed the sentiment that the accreditation system is far too complicated, and this is going to lead to a lack of national entities in the FIDS being able to be successfully accredited. As such, this would lead to eventual challenges during the project implementation stages. And the next piece of qualitative data we have is the results of a FIDS survey question, in which the question answered whether the GCF provides sufficient support for direct access entities in the FIDS to achieve accreditation. Now, less than 50% of respondents agreed with it. So over half of the respondents felt that GCF was not providing sufficient support for direct access entities in FIDS, or they did not know whether GCF was providing sufficient support. So this, as you can see, through the use of these 2 qualitative evaluation methods, we were able to validate some of our initial emerging theories from the quantitative analysis. And then the next slide will show how our emerging finding was further reinforced by visualizing it geospatially. Now, the countries highlighted blue are the FIDs that have zero access to direct access entities. So this includes both national and regional entities. And you can see here that the concentration of FIDs which are lacking direct access entities are in the 8th region. And finally, moving forward to the next slide, we have seen how over the course of the preceding few slides, we have seen how the FIDS evaluation uses a series of quantitative and qualitative evaluation methods to assess the GCF accreditation process. Now, the emerging evidence and findings from these were triangulated, and the final outcome was the policy finding. So the policy finding is as follows: the current GCF model for accreditation and access is disadvantaging FIDs with lower capacity, experience, or confidence to directly access the GCF. I should note, while this case study showcased the policy finding using the methods of geospatial data analysis, virtual interviews, online surveys, and quantitative data analysis, these were by no means the exhaustive list of evaluation methods, as we also relied heavily on methods such as literature review, benchmarking, and many other evaluation methods. So in conclusion, although the FIDS evaluations faced many unprecedented challenges which arose out of the COVID-19, this presentation has given an example of how we were able to successfully support the FIDS team and enable IEU to once again conduct a robust, evidence-based evaluation culminating in a final report full of credible policy findings. I would like to thank everybody for attending today, and I will give the floor back to our moderator, Yeonji Kim, who will take us through the rest of the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter, David, and Loren, for that wonderful presentation. I think we learned a lot about DataLab and how you guys supported the various data needs for the SIDS evaluation. So we are now opening the floor for any questions that you may have. I don't see any questions yet written in the chat box, but Jose Lindo from Spain, hello. Thank you very much for joining us. If you have any specific questions for any of the presenters, please feel free to raise your hand using the raise hand button, or just let me know. We would love to answer any questions that you may have. So since we don't have any specific questions coming from the audience, perhaps I can start with a question as the moderator, right? So perhaps for David, you know, SIDS report a lack of data as a major constraint. I think often that's the case. Did you have sufficient data to work with for the SIDS evaluation?
Hey, thank you, Yeonji. So the constraints in data capacity suffered by SIDS is something that we did encounter over the course of this evaluation. We tried to do some analysis on SIDS using external sources such as the Gini coefficient index, the ND gain, and the GDP death ratio, and we found that a lot of the SIDS were missing values for these. So to compensate for this, we had to rely on more internal sources. Yeah, I should add the majority of the analysis conducted in the SIDS evaluation was drawn from internal sources such as the GCF IPMS system and internal funding proposals and accreditation proposals.
Thank you for that, David. Maybe for Peter. So you talked about the different data sources that DataLab uses, and I'm just wondering if you could walk us through, when you have these raw data, what do you do? How do you process this data, and how do you ensure that the data is workable, right, without much bias? So yeah, tell us how DataLab does its work.
Thank you, Yancy. At the Data Lab, yeah, we really supporting the IEU to deliver data and evidence-driven evaluations. And the Data Lab, starting from when the evaluation matrix is developed to understand what are evaluation questions. For instance, if we say evaluation questions is looking at what are the expected results of the adaptation portfolio. So understanding that question give the data lab initial step to start to think about what could be the data sources, what are those data, and how we should move forward in terms of analyzing those data. So understanding those questions, we can move on to the GCF funding proposals, looking at the exactly section. For instance, looking at the investment criteria, impact potential, or sustainable development potential, looking at what are the expected results have been laid down by the funding proposals, or AE self-reported in terms of going to address to the countries. Then from that, we have some keyword search, extracting those information, but for the data lab, they usually do that manually. So that's really added value there because this data, to some extent, others are available, but others are not available in a very machine readable format. So that's the work Data Lab doing. And then we extract those information. We can put either in CSV files or Excel files so that we can use other software to run some analysis. And importantly, as I mentioned before incorporate any data to evaluation report, we usually run validation, talk with our secretariat colleagues, or looking through the GCF website, IPMS, to ensure that everything that we incorporate or any analysis that we are including in the evaluation report is accurate. That's important to have accurate information, because that will lead to the recommendations. So it's very important to have valid data, and that's how the Data Lab supporting the evaluation reports.
Thank you very much for that. And although 3 members of DataLab presented today, DataLab, of course, is a larger work stream within the IEU. And I do think that, you know, the IEU tagline is trusted evidence, informed policies, and high impact. And I think DataLab really supports the trusted evidence part. So we are also joined by Ms. Galina Uvarova, who is currently leading the IEU's DataLab. So Galina, perhaps you want to come in and tell us a little bit about DataLab, in addition to what Peter already said. Galina?
Thank you, Yonti. Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to hear, of course, if there are any concrete questions or interest about certain part of the DataLab. I think, yeah, there is a lot of background work that's being done. And we are, yeah, as Peter mentioned, we have interdisciplinary team and using many kinds of data analysis evaluation methods that we are bringing into our evaluations. And as we know that usually evaluation units do not do this kind of work. So for us, we feel ourselves like pretty positioned in a very special way, because we find we are finding new ways, and now especially focusing on geospatial analysis to see how that can support the findings that the IEU team is doing for the evaluations requested by the board. Yeah, if there are any specific questions, happy to answer. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm looking at the chat box. Our first question from the audience, Emmanuel, thank you very much for this question. So the way that DataLab works, it's very interesting. Are you planning to develop any method based on machine learning to extract data from the GCF documentation, such as project proposals? So I give this question to Galina.
Thank you, Yonji. I think David is also a person who has technical skills and background to answer this. But yeah, let me go. So yeah, one of the challenges, I think we covered this point pretty well, that there are cases where the GCF IT systems basically they're developing quite dynamically, and there is of course progress. Like through the course of existence of the DataLab, some of the extractions that we had to do previously, like we don't have to do anymore because there is a system for that, and this is great. Of course, funding proposals, it's obviously a document that like you still have a lot of richness of the detail and so on. And very often, of course, you can use software and libraries in R and Python to work with text. But the thing is that pretty often the concepts we are exploring, they need kind of human interpretation. So as of now, like the amount of the funding proposals that GCF has, it's still not large enough to actually efficiently train all the machine learning algorithms. So yeah, I think like this is the main limitation we're facing in terms of going to these technologies. David, do you want to add some?
Yeah, well, first of all, I will have to shamelessly plug the fact that I am working on a machine learning working paper at the moment, entitled The Applications of Machine Learning to Impact Evaluation. So obviously it's a scoping study which talks about how machine learning can be applied to the concept of impact evaluation, but also there is a section looking at how it can possibly be applied within the GCF and also IEU workstream. So as Galina mentioned, our current extraction methods are manual at the moment, and there have been thoughts on procuring some sort of a software that may be able to help with automated extraction of, but then again, it wouldn't be in-house development of a machine learning algorithm. It would be more that we would source an external software which would already have some sort of a algorithm embedded within to help with the extraction. But yeah, I will have to also reinforce Galina's point that some of the variables we deal in here are very qualitative in nature, and as such, they're pretty reliant on human interpretation. So I understand machine learning is really pushing the boundaries at the moment, and there's a lot of very advanced sentiment analysis algorithms that can actually interpret large blocks of text and code it in a machine readable format. But for the purposes of our work and also to ensure quality insurance, I feel it's best for now we continue our extractions manually. Thank you for a very interesting question.
Okay, I hope that answers your question, Emmanuel. And if any other participants wants to raise a question, please let us know. Yeah, you can raise your hand as well, and I will give you the floor. If you also have any specific questions about the content of today's presentation, we can also put the slides back in, and then you could ask us about any of the maps or graphs that we presented to you. But perhaps while waiting for our next question to arrive, maybe I can ask this question to David. You talked about how you had to rely more on online surveys and virtual interviews, of course, in time of COVID-19. But then how did DataLab and the SIDS evaluation team deal with the Zoom fatigue when conducting virtual interviews? Because you do so many of it, right? And was a completion rate of 42% for online surveys sufficient to gather good, sufficient data needed for the SIDS evaluation?
Thank you, Yonji, for these questions. So I will address the first one about our response rate of 42%. To be honest, this is my first time conducting a survey, so I don't have any reference points into saying what would be a acceptable or a high response rate, but gathering from the conversations that I've had internally, everybody on the SIDS team was very happy with the outcome of our survey. The 42% was considered to be a high rate, but at the end of the day, the quality also matters as much as the quantity. So what we gained out of the survey really helped us triangulate some of the existing findings from the qualitative and quantitative analysis that we did. And so, yeah, the online survey was an essential toolkit in the SIDS evaluation. And as for your first point on interview fatigue, to be honest, I don't think there was ever a way that we completely addressed with that. I mean, I think on some days, members of the evaluation team had 4 or 5 different virtual country missions. And also there was the issue of the different time zones. So being based in Korea, we conducted 6 virtual missions. And so out of the missions that were conducted in the Pacific SIDS, that was a very workable time zone for us. But when it came to virtual interviews in the Caribbean, as well as some of the ACE countries, that meant for a lot of long nights. The interview fatigue of participants was addressed through flexibility. So for example, we were quite flexible with our interviewees in allowing them to pick a time to schedule the survey. To schedule the interview, sorry. But yes, there was a challenge having to conduct most of our country missions virtually, but I think the SIDS team adapted well to the challenges.
Thank you for that. So I checked, the participants deck, and I know that we are joined by some advisors to the board members and also some secretariat staff, and as well as IEU colleagues. Please let us know if you have any specific questions for any of our presenters today. In the meantime, I will ask this question to Lauren. So thank you very much for your presentation on the geospatial analysis aspect of DataLab's work. But can you tell us more? Why is it important to have GIS, especially in the context of COVID-19? And how can GIS data inform IEU evaluations?
Thank you for this question. So it's a very good point. So I think geospatial data is freely available online, and it can compensate maybe the cancelled country mission. And it's also allowing us to better understand the physically feature of the country, and it's give us insightful data on the vulnerability of the country. So I think, yes, geospatial data analysis can be really useful for evaluation.
Thank you. Okay, another question, that I could ask perhaps David or Peter. Could you give an example of how data triangulation works? And how did you draw connections between GCF documentation and stakeholder interviews? David, you want to take that?
Yeah, okay. So I think the case study gave a pretty good overview of the concept of the data triangulation and also why data triangulation is so important for evaluation. So as my presentation showed, our emerging quantitative analysis showed that the SIDS national entities were underrepresented throughout the accreditation pipeline. And this was further validated by some of the findings that came out of our virtual interviews and surveys. So we had many respondents in the SIDS who said that it was very unlikely that their own country would ever be able to successfully get a national entity accredited. So that was just one example of how we triangulated data points from different evaluation methods that helped us arrive at a policy finding.
Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, just to add to David's answer, that was really a good response. But also the triangulation process, as you know, we cannot rely on only one data sources or data methods. For instance, qualitative or quantitative. There are some bias that can be introduced there. So to ensure that this evidence or these findings is really robust and valid, then it should be comes across from different sources. If we say seeds are suffering from, for instance, transaction costs, then we can see that from how the accreditation process goes. We don't see many AE from seeds countries. Is there, for instance, capacity problem or something else? Then we can validate also from the surveys or online survey or interviews, speaking with those nominated AEs, NDAs. So having this evidence from different data sources and lay out the same conclusion, that's where we say this evidence or these findings is robust and is true in terms of reaching and making the recommendations.
Thank you for that thoughtful answer. So perhaps I can ask this question. In addition to supporting all IEU evaluations, I know that there's a lot more that DataLab does, right? Such as also writing these various learning and working papers on topics such as machine learning, as David mentioned. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what kind of working papers you are currently drafting at the moment? Galina?
Yeah, sure. So I would say that when we speak about working papers, it often becomes interdisciplinary because people are working on different work streams, and that's often where these papers are kind of ideas are appearing is either some ideas we want to pilot prior to actually bringing these approaches to the evaluation, or something that came up in the evaluation during like some exploratory research, and there was not enough kind of space to embed it into the final report or flag it out enough. So with that, some of the works that are being done now, some of the working papers that are being written now is machine learning, as David mentioned earlier in this presentation. Peter was referring to Show Me the Money paper that is being, it's quite robust work, which is looking on, I think it's also good that Peter will want to come in on that, but basically looking how much money is getting to the end beneficiaries from the overall funds that are being committed and operationalized by the projects of GCF. There is also one of the examples we can speak about is where in the world is GCF, where we are looking at the spatial aspects of GCF that GCF is doing. So from one side, looking at how its locations where it works are aligned and how are they complementary and coherent with the other funds. From the other side, how well the projects are targeted, and that was a bit also kind of coming out in the slides that Lorraine was showing regarding like the targeting of the projects. And then of course we are looking further to look into within the country spatial analysis to see where exactly within the country the projects are being implemented, and because there are some peculiarities that you can take into account on such level as well. Peter, would you like to come in also to speak a bit about the work that's being done?
Thank you, Galina. So among 4 pillars of the IEU is on the advisory services and learning. So and considering that how the evaluation of climate change intervention is new, there are something to learn. I mean, in terms of methodologies and other evidences that we can find from the field. So with that, the IEU DataLab also is working very hard. As already mentioned, few papers that we are working on. We have Where the World is GCF, trying to see how GCF perform in comparison to other climate change organizations. Also, we have already published 2 months ago the impact investing paper, try to explore on the innovations areas that GCF could invest or could financing. And also we are almost about to publish another working paper on behavioral science, looking at the last mile questions of the GCF interventions, where how GCF should invest in making the last mile changes, behavioral change to the developing countries, speaking about communities. And also, as this I've already mentioned a lot about machine learning, we are trying to move with what is happening in the world right now. So with that, this is the work that DataLab is doing to make sure that we are in the advisory services and learning, we are still on top, not behind or not outdated methodologies.
Yes, thank you very much for that. I know that within the international climate finance arena, there is high interest, right, to follow and track climate finance, how the fund is being dispersed, where the finance is flowing to. And it's really good to hear that IEU's DataLab is already doing that work by working on Show Me the Money, that working paper. So very good to hear that. And there was a question from Helen. So moving forward, will the DataLab be taking on more virtual interviews in comparison to country missions? Perhaps, Galina, do you want to answer this question?
Sure. Yeah, I think in IEU, we always rely on the country missions, like that there is no replacement for getting this sort of information. Being directly on site where project is being implemented, communicating with stakeholders. As we know, for now, yeah, many projects of GCF are on the early stages of implementation, so it's not always easy, or there are tools even to get to know what kind of challenges are being faced there. Of course, we get back information through APRs and so on, but there is no replacement for the country missions. And of course, it depends on how global pandemic will go. As of now, we know that from this evaluation from this year, we learned a lot. My colleagues presented very well what tools we have on hand to continue doing rigorous research for the evaluations, to inform the data aspect of the findings that we are confirming. So definitely the country missions should be done, but we will see how the situation in the world develops.
Just really quickly, David, do you want to come in on this and share your thoughts?
Yeah, so I just want to reiterate what Galina said essentially about how moving forward, the IEU would preferably be able to conduct country missions in person again next year, which would result in less virtual interviews. However, this is of course dependent on the COVID-19 situation, as GCF and the IEU strive to make sure that the health and well-being of all of its staff is looked after. Therefore, it would be difficult to justify going into the field at a time if the pandemic has not been substantially cleared up. While I think the evaluation team did very well in successfully adapting to virtual interviews this year, in the long run, it would be more preferable to have the in-person interviews as our main form of interviews, given that I feel there's a lot of the intangibles is lost when you are talking with someone over Zoom. For example, you miss out on a lot of nonverbal communication. It's difficult to build a rapport with a respondent over the course of 1 hour, whereas actually flying to the country and getting to meet them in person and travel to interviews together and have meals together. So yeah, it will be interesting to see how next year, 2021, how the IEU is forced to conduct our country missions then.
Thank you for that. We've exhausted our time, but is there any last minute questions from the audience? Does anyone want to come in before we close? Okay, I see none. Let me put my closing slides back in. All right, so thank you very much for staying with us until the last hour. As you could see, we will be having another side event 1 week from now. So next Thursday, 5 November at 5 p.m. KST. And this side event will look at the content of the SIDS evaluation report itself. So join us as we explore the challenges that SIDS face alongside the key findings and recommendations of the IEU's latest evaluation. All right, and then really quickly, the IEU has its own podcast series called Evaluator, and we have our latest episode. We did an interview with Dr. Josna Puri, Joe, on the past, present, and future of the IEU, so be sure to check it out. And then also, we publish a lot of short blogs to disseminate our findings and lessons learned to a wider audience. And our latest blog is about designing an M&E system for impact evaluation, co-authored by Dr. Joe Puri as well. So yes, it's an interesting read, so please check it out. So that brings us to the end of our program today. Thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon. If we miss any of your questions, please be sure to write us at ieu@gcfund.org. Thank you very much, and we will see you again soon.